So this is your second installment in your Chapter 22 lecture on the evidence of evolution. So far what we've been spending some time on are the classic examples of evidence for evolution, being Darwin's finches and peppered moths. We'll continue on here with additional evidence and begin with artificial selection. Now, artificial selection is basically where humans have identified traits that they want to exacerbate or avoid, and we choose which individuals with desirable phenotypes to breed. Over time, artificial selection will lead to evolutionary change when, of course, the traits are genetically based. And we see this in both laboratory experiments and in domestication experiments. So in our first set of laboratory experiments, some have been done on Drosophila melanogaster, the fruit fly. Studies have been done to look at variable body size, eye color, growth rate, lifespan, exploratory behavior, etc. In one experiment, bristle selection was studied, and basically what was done was the average number of bristles was 9.5. This is not the graph for this experiment, that's a second experiment. And the 9.5 bristles was the average at the beginning of the experiment. So of that population, the 20% of the population with the most bristles were selected as parents. 86 generations later, 40 bristles was the average. That's quite a bit different. Now, this one here is showing you a different experiment where either the highest and the lowest population members with numbers of bristles were bred only. So therefore, those that were in the middle were not bred. And after only 35 generations, these two populations didn't overlap at all. So very, very quick evolutionary rate. Other experiments that are related have been done looking at the rate of tooth decay in rats and their resistance. And they were able to increase the onset time of tooth decay by 5 times after only 20 generations. Other artificial selection includes agricultural examples. This has been done for centuries before people really knew the genetic basis of it. We've done this with cattle, pigs, crops, you name it. If we eat it, we've done some agricultural selection and some artificial selection in agriculture. Here what you're looking at is kind of the timeline or the family history of modern corn. Back in 1896 began the selection for oil content in corn kernels, and it was about 4.5% initially. But then only the top 20% of oil producers were allowed to reproduce. And then over time, 90 generations or years later, the oil content increased by 450%. It's pretty amazing. So this is your modern day corn. The female, of course, is what we actually eat, that has the endosperm inside of the kernels. We've also used artificial selection in domestication, specifically with our pets. We've applied artificial selection to our pets for all kinds of reasons. Dogs are a classic example. If you look at the different breeds of dogs, they've all been developed for a specific purpose. For example, the Greyhound has an amazing running ability. Long legs, the long tail for balance, the arched back for shock absorption. Dachshunds for their ability to enter holes to get after badgers with their short legs, their long back. Even colorful cats and pigeons just for their aesthetics. All of these have been developed by humans, and we can apply this to just about any domestic animal breed that you're familiar with. This has also been done with foxes. Foxes have been domesticated in other countries for quite a long time and selected for their docile behaviors. And as more and more foxes are selected and they're docile, or something called neotenic behaviors, where they kind of retain some characteristics of the young of their species, this has actually led to the evolution of other dog-like traits. We see that in their color patterns, their floppy ears, their curled tails, their shorter legs and tails. All of these traits are actually domesticated dog traits. And so what we're seeing is really some pleiotropy, which is basically, remember, the selection for one trait applies to other. So here, the selection for behavior has actually revealed that the genes responsible for the docile behavior are linked to genes for other traits. Very interesting. So can selection produce major evolutionary change? Yes. Consider domestic dogs. only domesticated and they were only domesticated and originated from wolves 10,000 years ago. If fossils of modern dog breeds were found by scientists, they would think they would be different species. There's actually more variation within dog breeds than within the entire Canidae family, which includes coyotes, foxes, jackals, and wolves. So the take-home message here is that artificial selection leads to rapid and substantial results over short periods of time, thus demonstrating the power of selection and to produce major evolutionary change. So now let's look at some real concrete evidence for evolution, the fossil record. Now first what I want to do, I think you understand that this would be direct evidence for evolution. And we do have a much better understanding of our fossil record today than during Darwin's time. We've got vast collections of specimens preserved in amber, permafrost, dry caves, and even rock fossils. But what I really want you to understand is how unlikely the process of fossilization is. Not to mention, do we actually find the fossils? Because they don't pop up out of the sand with red flags saying, hey, come over here, I'm a fossil. So 3 things have to occur before an organism can be preserved as a fossil. First, the organism, upon death, or during death, needs to be immediately buried by sediment. Because if it wasn't, it would be eroded, strewn about by wind, scavenged. All of these things would tear it apart. Then once it's buried, it has to be mineralized. So in other words, the rock minerals that would be carried through water, percolating through the soil, would have to replace the organic material in the organism itself. Then the surrounding sediment around that, well, organism, fossil, whatever stage it's in, would have to harden to form rock to protect it. So this process is really rare because of the scavenging and the weathering and erosion that I was talking about. Then, how do we find the fossil? If it gets buried deep within the sediment, unless we know where to look, we might not find it. So even though it's tough to find fossils, we found enough to tell a pretty detailed story about the evolution of life on Earth. But how do we use the fossils that we find? How do we find out how old they are? What kind of story can we tell? There are 2 types of dating. Now I'm not talking about, you and somebody else. I'm talking about how do we know which specimens are older than the others? How do we tell how old each specimen is? There are 2 types of dating methods. There's relative dating and absolute dating. Relative dating basically places rocks and embedded fossils in an ordered age relative to one another. In other words, fossils that we find deeper are most likely older than those that we find in a shallower stratum or layer of rock. And we use known erosion rates and the knowledge about the rock material to estimate their age. If we know that sandstone erodes in a particular area at a specific rate, we can use that to figure out how old the fossil embedded in it is. Now, absolute dating is where we understand the process of radioactive decay, and we can apply that to how old the fossil is. Now, radioactive decay only works for igneous rock because, remember, this comes from magma, which is then lava once it spews from the Earth's surface. This is the only rock that will contain radioactive elements from the Earth's core. And these radioactive elements are unstable. These radioactive isotopes decay into more stable daughter isotopes at a known rate. And when we know these rates, and we can find out what proportion of a rock contains a certain type of radioactive element, then we can backtrack. Okay, well, how many half-lives has this material gone through? And therefore we can estimate the age of the rock. So for example, uranium-238 has a half-life of 4.5 billion years. Now what that means is it takes 4.5 billion years for half of the parental isotope to decay into a daughter isotope. So if you find a rock sample near a fossil and the rock sample is 50% uranium-238, then that means that it is 4.5 billion years old. It's not usually that cut and dry, but that's just a simple example. So in half-lives, if one half-life has passed by, then half of the parent isotope is remaining. If two half-lives have passed by, then 25%, etc., etc. Make sure you understand this concept and that you could do some simple math if given an example. So let's continue on with how to use fossils. Now when we look at all the fossils that we have, it paints a picture for how organisms have lived on land and kind of the parade of life, if you will. It shows a succession of evolutionary change from initial eukaryotes to plants and early vertebrates and fish, the colonization of land by animals, insects and amphibians, reptiles, mammals, dinosaurs, all the way to humans, etc. Now, we would be remiss if we didn't mention that there are gaps in the fossil record. Of course there are. If you remember the processes in order to form a fossil, and the fact that we probably won't even find the fossil, of course there are gaps. So this should not be surprising. However, the gaps are being filled in bit by bit, and one great example is whale and dolphin evolution. This is just a partial reconstruction of what we know about whale and dolphin evolution. A very interesting tale. Please take some time to read through this. We also have a nice story about how snakes evolved and that they are the descendants of lizards. Oyster shell evolution is actually a story that we know really detailed, that over time their shells have gotten flatter and flatter to give them more stability on substrates. Over 12 million years of evolution, one of the strongest lines of evolution that we have, in fact. So the fossil record provides a clear record of the major evolutionary transitions that have occurred over time. And understanding the transitions is really important, because from there we can really see those intermediate fossils and the changes that occurred from one species to the next. Let's take a detailed look at one of those examples, being horses. Horses belong to the family Equidae. This includes horses, zebras, donkeys, and asses. Now, modern horses we know to be long-legged, fast-running animals that are adapted to living in open grasslands. They're all among the genus Equus, which at its height actually gave rise to over 34 genera since the origin of the Eocene period, or 55 million years ago. Let me skip ahead so you can take a look at that. So way back here, about before 55 million years ago, and then on, all these dots represent different genera, each of them being a genus of different, basically horses, if you will. The first horse was the Hyracotherium. So let me scroll down so you can see artist's reconstruction of that. I'll come back up to my notes now. Now these early horse species were very small, short legs, broad feet. They lived in the woodlands, and they were browsers. Now a browser is different from a grazer. A browser is more like a deer, where they're eating leaves off of bushes, they might be eating twigs, so they have a more mixed diet. Very, very small, and over time evolved to modern horses via increased size, a reduction in the number of toes, and changes in the shape of their tooth and the size of their teeth. Not just one tooth, all of their teeth did the same thing. So first let's look at size. The first species were very small, about dog-sized, versus modern horses, who now are between 100 pounds to a ton. And horses, while they don't necessarily mimic dogs in all of their diversity, they're pretty darn diverse, especially when you consider ponies and miniature horses and thoroughbreds and your draft horses. So the first 30 million years or so, we don't see much of a change in the size of horses. So you can see that they really don't change for quite a bit of time in their size. But then, this explosion in differences in size. Another difference that you can see, this is to represent the bones in their leg, is a reduction in the number of toes. Early horses had their toes encased in pads, much like dogs and cats. versus the modern hoof, which is hardened. The Hyracotherium had 4 toes in the front and 3 in the back. Modern horses have just 1 toe on each leg. But those of you that are familiar with horses know that on the inside of their legs is kind of a flattened, almost like a callus. It's called a chestnut. I almost forgot what it was called. And that's something that we kind of peel off to make sure they don't stick out too far and rub or catch on brush. Those are the remnants of some of those old toes. Think about your dogs and whether or not they have dew claws that you might get clipped off when they're puppies. Another example of toe reduction. So the fossil record shows us a pattern of central toe elongation, the development of a bony hoof, and the reduction or even loss of other toes on other branches. And these toes actually, as they became reduced, became part of, and in some cases fused, to that central bone. Now their teeth also changed. They became longer, and the ridges, this is basically the occlusal or chewing surface of the teeth, became more complex, and so that they could chew better, basically, or tougher vegetation. We also see changes in their skull that added strength for continual chewing, and this happened within the past 20 million years. Many of these changes occurred likely because of climatic changes in North America during the Miocene and Oligocene epochs between 20 and 25 million years ago, as the grasslands became more and more widespread. Now, this elongation of the leg and the single toe have a lot to do with being fast runners. If think about sprinting versus jogging. If you're sprinting, you go up on your toes because it lengthens your leg. But if you're jogging, you're just down on your flat foot. And if you think about all of your ungulates that are prey species, horses, gazelles, antelopes, they have to run away from predators. And they're up on their tippy toes, if you will, on their hooves. It's kind of like walking on your fingernails. But then the predators, while they need to be fast, they can't be on their tippy toes because they lose their flexibility and their ability to grasp. So for these horses and other species like them, having that flexibility in your toes and shorter limbs is not very advantageous in predator escape. It's better to be a sprinter and get rid of some of your agility, if you will. So when we think about the trends of evolution, even though we've lost all these other horse species along the way, and we have just a few today, thinking about, remember, not just modern horses, but also your asses and or some of these other ones we'd mentioned, zebras, donkeys, etc. Even though we've lost all those, remember that evolution is not linear. It doesn't have a predicted fate or desired end product. And evolution rates can widely vary. The evolution was pretty slow for horses in the beginning, but right in here where we have some climatic changes, we see a big burst of evolution. Or speciation would be a better term. And changes can occur simultaneously in multiple lineages. So even on this phylogenetic tree right in here, where you have multiple branches, you can have evolutionary changes happening on every single one of them at the same time. So today, even though we don't have very much diversity in the horse line, there's just the one genus, there were 13 genera during the Miocene epoch just in North America. Wouldn't that be interesting to see? 13 different genera, and then all the different species of those just in our continent. They varied widely in their body size and other characteristics, and they probably lived in different habitats and had different resource needs. So the extensive fossil record for horses gives us a very detailed view of the evolutionary diversification of this group, from the small forest dwellers that they were to large, fast, modern grassland species. And that's the end of this segment.